What would you do if you checked your security cameras from 200 miles away and saw your son-in-law secretly walking strangers through your living room, trying to sell a house he didn't even own? 37 years of building commercial bridges taught me one absolute truth. Every structure has a breaking point. My name is Leonard. I spent 4 decades as a structural engineer. I lived out of cheap roadside motels, ate cold dinners hovering over massive drafting tables, and calculated stress loads until my vision physically blurred. I sacrificed vacations. I missed holidays. Every dollar I bled went into a single, unbreakable dream. A secluded, heavy timber cabin deep in the northern Minnesota wilderness, far from concrete, far from the noise, far from people. I didn't just buy the property blind. That's a fool's game. I spent 6 agonizing months running deep soil tests, inspecting the foundation, and charting the structural integrity of the roof beams before my signature ever touched the deed. I knew every inch of that house before I even held the keys. Out here, cell service is practically a myth. So, the very first thing I built wasn't a cozy fire in the hearth. It was a high-gain cellular booster and a commercial-grade satellite dish array. I strapped myself to a harness and bolted the hardware directly to the highest ridge of the roofline, wiring it down into a heavy-duty router in the basement. I wanted total isolation. I didn't want to be vulnerable. For exactly 24 hours, it was absolute paradise. Just the bitter wind howling through the old-growth pines, the heavy gray mist rolling off the freezing, glass-like water of the lake, a great blue heron standing completely motionless on the shoreline. I laid my blueprints out on the massive cedar dining table. I poured a dark cup of black coffee. I finally breathed. Then, the phone rang. It was Gareth, my son-in-law. Gareth is the kind of man who wears a three-piece suit to a casual Sunday family barbecue. He works in commercial real estate, possesses a massive, fragile ego, and has a dangerous habit of mistaking my quiet, calculating nature for weakness. I had noticed a deeply concerning shift in my daughter, Diane, over the last few years. Her bright, infectious laugh had steadily dulled. Her weekly phone calls had grown short, clipped, and heavily monitored by the suffocating shadow of her husband looming in the background. I answered the call, expecting a stiff, obligatory congratulations on my first official day of retirement. I was entirely wrong. "Leonard," he said. No greeting, no warmth, just a sharp, authoritative bark. "I need to give you the logistics for my parents. They've had a severe housing issue down here. They're moving into the cabin." I stopped breathing. I stared at the flickering screen of my phone. He didn't ask. He didn't suggest. He informed me, Gareth. I said, keeping my voice dangerously level. "I just closed on this property yesterday. It is my private home. It is not a boarding house." He sighed. A loud, exaggerated, deeply condescending sound that echoed through the receiver. "Look, Diane and I already discussed it. It's a massive property. You're just one old guy rattling around up there alone. It's incredibly selfish to hoard all that space when family is in desperate need. They'll be driving up by Friday." The audacity was absolutely staggering. He was deliberately weaponizing my own daughter's name against me. Trying to paint me as the villain in a toxic narrative he was entirely fabricating. But I am an engineer. I don't react to stress. I calculate the load. "Let me be entirely clear," I told him, every word dropping like a frozen block of ice. "If anyone steps onto my land without my express, written invitation, they will be treated as trespassers." The answer is absolutely not. There was a long, heavy silence on the line, the kind of suffocating silence that immediately precedes a shock wave. "You're making a massive mistake, Leonard," Gareth sneered, his voice dropping into a vicious, ugly register. "You're too old to be managing that place alone anyway. You just watch what happens next." The line went dead. I stood in the center of my flawless, quiet cabin, listening to the dial tone ring out into the empty room. The peace was gone. The retirement I bled for was officially over. I walked over to the front window and stared out at the dark water of the lake. Before I left the city, I had handed Diane a single brass spare key. I explicitly told her it was strictly for absolute life-or-death emergencies. I didn't know it yet, but Gareth had already copied it behind her back. He thought he had outsmarted a tired, helpless old man. He thought I would eventually fold under the pressure and hand over the keys to my kingdom. He forgot that I spent my entire life designing things that do not break, and he had absolutely no idea the kind of inescapable trap I was about to build for him. Gareth's parents didn't just ignore my explicit warning. They showed up in my driveway exactly 3 days later, strutting toward my porch like they already held the deed. The heavy, suffocating silence of the lake was abruptly shattered by the violent crunch of tires on gravel. A pristine, silver rental SUV shifted into park. Out stepped Earl and Pauline Nolan. Earl looked around, his eyes sweeping over the cedar siding and the expansive custom dock. He wasn't admiring the craftsmanship. He was calculating the market value. He was pricing my life's work. Pauline swatted at a mosquito, her face twisting in disgust as she complained loudly about the mud on her designer shoes. They marched up the front steps, fully expecting me to step aside and hand over the keys. I stood dead center on the threshold, a physical, immovable barrier. I didn't offer my hand. I didn't offer a fake, polite smile. "You are trespassing," I said. Earl stopped, puffing his chest out and immediately dropping the superficial pleasantries. He shifted into a register I recognized instantly, the arrogant, demanding tone of a man who had spent his entire life bullying people into submission. "Now you listen to me, Leonard," Earl demanded, stepping onto the top stair. "Gareth assured us this was a done deal. We have every right to be here. You've got 3 huge bedrooms and you're just one old man living alone. It is fundamentally selfish to deny family a place to stay when they desperately need it." That single word hung in the freezing northern air. I stepped forward, forcing Earl to back up or risk a physical collision. "I spent 37 years eating cold lunches at a drafting table," I told him, my voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper. "I traded the best years of my physical youth for this land. You failed to plan your own life, and now you want to parasite off mine. Get off my property, now, or the sheriff will drag you away in handcuffs." Pauline grabbed Earl's arm, her eyes wide with genuine shock. They had expected an easy mark, a lonely retiree, eager for company. They retreated to the rental car, Earl shouting empty, pathetic threats out the window as the tires violently spun in the dirt, speeding back toward the highway. Most men would have gone inside, poured a stiff drink, and tried to calm down. Not me. I recognized a probing attack when I saw one. Gareth had intentionally sent them to test the load-bearing walls of my boundaries. When a structure is tested by external pressure, an engineer does not sit back and hope for the best. An engineer reinforces the weak points. I immediately locked the cabin, got in my truck, and drove into the nearest town. I bypassed the grocery store and marched straight into the local hardware supplier. I didn't buy a simple deadbolt. I purchased a commercial-grade, motion-activated security grid. 3 high-definition night vision cameras with direct cellular uplink capabilities. I spent the next 6 grueling hours balancing on an aluminum ladder in the biting wind. I mounted the first camera high up in a massive pine tree, covering the long driveway approach. The second went beneath the reinforced eaves of the garage, aimed directly at the front door. The third covered the massive blind spot near the boathouse. I calculated the angles with absolute mathematical precision, overlapping sightlines. Utilizing the massive satellite booster I had installed on day one, 0 dead zones, 0 blind spots. I had successfully transformed my peaceful, isolated sanctuary into an impenetrable digital fortress. But physical defense wasn't enough. I needed a legal shield. The next morning, I walked into a dusty, wood-paneled office situated above a tractor supply store. Sitting behind the desk was Kathleen Mercer. She wasn't a slick corporate suit. She was a ruthless, no-nonsense rural attorney who didn't waste oxygen on pleasantries. I laid out the facts. Cold, hard data, no emotion. She listened silently, tapping a silver pen against her legal pad. "Mr. Whitfield," she said, leaning forward, her eyes locking onto mine. "This is your fortress. You have zero legal obligation to house a single soul. But you need to understand Gareth's actual strategy here. If his parents manage to stay on this property for 30 days, they establish quarters rights." My blood ran completely cold. "Once they establish residency," Kathleen continued, "the police cannot remove them. You would have to drag them through a brutal, months-long eviction process in civil court. He isn't just asking for a favor. He is trying to legally colonize your property." I pulled out my checkbook. I wrote a massive $2,000 retainer check and slid it across her desk. Build me an indestructible legal wall, I ordered. She accepted the check with a dangerous, predatory smile. Document every single breath they take on your land, she instructed. But playing defense is how you lose a war. I needed to understand the structural integrity of my enemy. Why was Gareth, a supposedly highly successful commercial real estate broker, so incredibly desperate to dump his parents in a remote cabin? What was he hiding? I reached out to a private investigator in Minneapolis, a veteran named Beverly Holt. Her only directive was to rip Gareth's financial life down to the studs. I needed to know exactly what kind of deception he was pulling behind my daughter's back. The perimeter was officially fortified. The digital traps were wired, hidden, and armed. All I had to do was sit on my dock and wait for Gareth to make a fatal miscalculation. And it didn't take long. Just days later, I was hundreds of miles away in the city for a routine doctor's appointment when my phone violently buzzed in my pocket. The cameras had triggered, and the nightmare Gareth had brought to my doorstep was infinitely worse than I had ever imagined. I was sitting in a sterile, fluorescent lit medical clinic in Duluth, exactly 200 miles away from my sanctuary. It was a routine checkup, the kind of mundane, everyday errand that lulls you into a false sense of security. I was staring blankly at a faded magazine on the waiting room table, waiting for my name to be called. Then, my phone violently vibrated against my ribs. A silent, digital alarm. I pulled the device from my jacket. The screen was immediately illuminated with a push notification from my newly installed security grid. Motion detected. Zone 2. The front porch. I tapped the alert, pulling up the live, high-definition cellular feed. My breath caught in my throat. Gareth was standing on my cedar porch, and he wasn't alone. He was accompanied by a man holding a thick leather clipboard and a woman who was actively pointing at the architecture. I watched, completely paralyzed by the sheer audacity of the scene, as Gareth reached into his tailored coat pocket. He pulled out a shiny brass key. He slid it into my deadbolt. He turned it, and he pushed my front door wide open. My blood turned to absolute ice. Before I retired, I had handed my daughter, Diane, a single emergency key. I explicitly told her to bury it in the bottom of her purse, to be used strictly for life or death scenarios. She had promised me it was secure. Gareth had stolen it. He had gone behind his own wife's back, taken the emergency key, and quietly copied it. I watched the live video feed stream directly to my phone, the timestamp ticking away in the corner of the screen. Gareth confidently escorted the two strangers right into my living room. He gestured expansively toward the custom stone fireplace. He pointed out the panoramic views of the lake. The woman began pacing the length of the main window, measuring the glass with her hands, clearly visualizing where her furniture would go. He wasn't just trespassing, he was hosting an unauthorized showing. He was actively trying to sell my home. For exactly 22 minutes, I sat completely frozen in that clinic waiting room, recording every single second of the brutal violation. I watched a man who had never driven a nail or poured a foundation in his life confidently barter away my 37 years of blood and sweat. He thought I was a helpless old man. He thought he had outmaneuvered me. He didn't realize he had just handed me the exact rope I needed to legally hang him. I walked out of the clinic, got into my truck, and locked the doors. Before I could even put the key in the ignition, my phone chimed again. This time, it wasn't the security system. It was an encrypted email from Beverly Holt, the ruthless private investigator I had hired in Minneapolis. The subject line simply read, Initial Target Assessment. I opened the attached PDF dossier. It was 60 pages thick, heavily stamped with red financial warnings. What I read in that freezing truck didn't just make me angry. It fundamentally changed the entire landscape of this war. Gareth's arrogant, tailored suit persona was a complete, fabricated illusion. He wasn't a successful commercial real estate broker. He was completely, devastatingly bankrupt. 18 months ago, a catastrophic commercial investment had violently collapsed, leaving his parents saddled with a massive $75,000 civil judgment. The luxury apartment Gareth had claimed they were simply renovating had actually been aggressively foreclosed on by the bank. But that wasn't the detail that made my vision blur with absolute rage. Beverly had dug deep into my daughter's joint accounts. Over the past 10 months, Gareth had been quietly siphoning money away from Diane, a massive sum. Exactly $48,000 had been systematically transferred out of their savings and funneled directly into hidden accounts controlled by his father to pay off their toxic debts. Diane's hard-earned teacher salary, her future, her security, all of it, completely drained by the man who swore to protect her. And then, at the very bottom of page 14, I found the fatal blow. Gareth hadn't just drained the cash, he had completely destroyed her credit. He had forged Diane's signature to open a massive, unsecured line of credit entirely in her name. He was actively burying my daughter in an avalanche of debt she didn't even know existed. I sat in the cab of my truck, staring blindly at the steering wheel. The parents needing a place to stay, the sudden, aggressive demands for my cabin, the unauthorized showing with potential buyers. It was never about finding a quiet place for his elderly parents. That was a pathetic smokescreen. Gareth was drowning. He was suffocating under a mountain of hidden debt, and he had looked at my pristine, fully paid off lakeside property and saw a life raft. He planned to move his parents in, establish squatters' rights, force me into a brutal legal gridlock, and ultimately coerce me into selling the property to bail him out. I carefully closed the PDF file. The simmering, defensive anger that had kept me awake for weeks evaporated entirely. In its place was a terrifying, crystal clear calm. This was no longer a simple boundary dispute over a retirement cabin. This was a rescue mission. Gareth had declared total financial war on my only child. He had stolen her future, and he was about to discover exactly what happens when you corner an engineer who knows how to systematically dismantle a target piece by piece. But first, I had to do the hardest thing a father can ever do. I had to shatter my daughter's heart. There is no painless way to tell your only child that her entire life is a meticulously constructed lie. You cannot soften the blow. You just have to drop the hammer and pray she survives the impact. I arranged to meet Diane on a bleak, gray Saturday morning at an isolated diner overlooking the Duluth harbor. I needed neutral ground, a place far beyond the suffocating, manipulative reach of her husband. When she walked through the glass doors, my heart physically ached. She looked exhausted, not just tired. It was the deep, marrow-hollowing fatigue of a woman who had spent years unknowingly carrying a parasite. I didn't offer empty small talk. I didn't ask how the drive was. I simply slid the thick, heavy manila folder across the scuffed formica table. "Open it," I said. She hesitated, her fingers trembling slightly against the cardboard edge. Then, she flipped the cover. The very first page was the devastating bankruptcy decree. Her eyes darted across the red-stamped legal text. Then, I watched her turn the page to the wire transfers. Row after row of undeniable banking data. $48,000, her hard-earned savings, her security, her future quietly siphoned away into a financial black hole controlled by her father-in-law. Then she saw the forged line of credit. I watched my daughter's face cycle through a terrifying spectrum of emotion, confusion, desperate denial, and finally, absolute, shattering devastation. He told me he was looking for investments, she whispered, her voice cracking, her eyes filling with tears she refused to let fall. He told me we were building a future. I reached across the table and placed my tablet directly in front of her. I pressed play. The crisp, time-stamped security footage lit up the screen. Gareth, smiling his slick, arrogant smile, escorting strangers through my living room. Selling the home I bled for while I was sitting in a doctor's waiting room 200 miles away. He is not building a future, Diane, I told her, my voice low and unyielding. He is building a lifeboat. And he is perfectly willing to let you drown to stay afloat. She pressed her hands flat against the table. She closed her eyes. I didn't try to comfort her with empty platitudes. I let her feel the agonizing weight of the betrayal. When she finally opened her eyes, the tears were gone. What remained was a cold, terrifying clarity. She possessed her father's mind. I gave her my attorney's card and told her to hire a forensic accountant. I explicitly instructed her to go home, act completely normal, and say absolutely nothing to Gareth. Let him feel safe. Let him feel invincible. While Diane quietly gathered her ammunition, my attorney, Kathleen, fired the opening salvo. She drafted a brutal, uncompromising cease and desist letter and launched it directly at Gareth's legal counsel. We laid out the unauthorized property showings, the trespassing, and the predatory financial moves, but a cornered rat does not surrender. It bites. Gareth's response wasn't a retreat. It was an incredibly dangerous escalation. His lawyer fired back a completely fabricated claim, stating that the stolen funds were actually family loans and that Gareth inherently possessed a partial ownership stake in my cabin. It was pure legal fiction designed to drag me into a chaotic, bankrupting civil gridlock. But Gareth didn't stop there. He decided to play his dirtiest card. 3 days later, a stark white envelope arrived from the State Department of Human Services. Someone had filed an anonymous, urgent Adult Protective Services report. The document claimed I was suffering from severe, rapidly advancing cognitive decline. It stated I was hoarding garbage, living in squalor, and completely incapable of managing my own affairs. It was a textbook, deeply repulsive predator tactic. Discredit the witness. Declare the old man legally senile. Strip away my property rights and place me under a court-appointed conservatorship controlled by the family. Gareth wanted me locked inside a facility so he could freely liquidate my home. Less than 48 hours later, a social worker named Shirley knocked on my heavy cedar door. She arrived completely unannounced. She was expecting a chaotic, dementia-ridden disaster zone. She was expecting a confused, hostile old man. I welcomed her inside with a calm, polite smile. I poured her a fresh cup of coffee. I offered her a seat at my pristine dining table. For the next hour, I gave her a master class in structural organization. I walked her through my garage, where every single tool was outlined and hung with mathematical precision. I presented my flawlessly categorized financial ledgers. I answered every single probing question with razor-sharp, surgical accuracy. An engineer's mind does not slip. Shirley slowly closed her notebook. She looked around the immaculate sunlit cabin, and then she looked at me. "Mr. Whitfield," she said quietly, her professional mask dropping for just a fraction of a second. "The individual who filed this report claimed you couldn't even remember your own name. Furthermore, my office traced the IP address of the anonymous tip." She paused, offering a knowing glance. "It originated from a commercial real estate firm in Chicago." Gareth had massively overplayed his hand. He hadn't just lied to a stubborn old man. He had intentionally submitted a fraudulent, malicious report to a state agency. The senility smear had completely collapsed. The defensive perimeter held strong. Gareth thought he was slowly burying me in the dirt, but he didn't realize he was actually digging his own grave. And now, the true architect of his destruction was finally ready to step out of the shadows. The moment a predator realizes he is actually the prey is a profoundly quiet event. Diane didn't confront Gareth in their home. She didn't scream, cry, or hurl shattered plates against the wall. She utilized the exact same cold, calculating engineering mindset she inherited from me. Instead, she walked directly into the lavish, glass-walled office of Gareth's high-priced attorney. She bypassed her husband completely. She sat down at the sprawling mahogany conference table and slid the forensic accountant's devastating 60-page dossier across the polished wood. The lawyer opened it, and the room went dead silent. Diane systematically walked him through the wreckage. The $48,000 quietly embezzled from her joint accounts, the forged signatures on the massive unsecured line of credit, and finally the absolute killing blow, the crisp, time-stamped video footage of Gareth illegally escorting buyers through my living room. She didn't raise her voice. She simply delivered a terrifyingly clear ultimatum. "Withdraw the fabricated lawsuit against my father by 5 o'clock today," she stated, her gaze utterly unyielding. "Or every single page of this dossier goes directly to the district attorney, the state banking commission, and the commercial real estate licensing board. I will see him indicted before the week is out." Gareth's attorney didn't argue. He didn't bluff. He recognized a total, catastrophic structural failure when he saw one. He formally dropped Gareth as a client less than 2 hours later. The collapse of Gareth's fabricated empire was absolute, rapid, and merciless. Diane filed for a brutal, uncompromising divorce the very next morning. Stripped of his wife's income, completely locked out of my assets, and suffocating under the crushing weight of his hidden debts, Gareth was left entirely exposed to his aggressive creditors. But the consequences didn't stop at the divorce decree. The state commerce department launched a massive, sweeping investigation into his fraudulent real estate practices. They uncovered multiple instances of stolen deposits and aggressively misrepresented property values. His commercial broker's license was permanently revoked. His parents, entirely bankrupt and entirely out of options, were forced to move into a cramped, subsidized apartment 3 states away. Gareth had arrogantly tried to steal an empire. He walked away with absolutely nothing. While his life burned to the ground, my daughter found her sanctuary. Diane and my 4-year-old granddaughter packed their bags and moved up to the cabin to ride out the bitter legal storm. We spent the freezing Minnesota winter inside the fortress I had built. We made thick pancakes on Sunday mornings while massive snowdrifts piled high against the reinforced cedar walls. Slowly, piece by piece, I watched the heavy, suffocating weight lift from my daughter's shoulders. I heard her bright, genuine laugh echo through the hallways for the first time in years. When the ice finally thawed into a brilliant golden spring, the war was officially over. On the first warm Saturday of May, we stood together on the heavy cedar dock. I handed my granddaughter a small, brightly colored fishing rod I had bought months prior and kept hidden in the closet, waiting for this exact moment. I knelt beside her. I showed her how to carefully bait the tiny hook, how to cast the line without tangling the spool. She wasn't particularly good at it. She snagged the line twice and dropped her bait onto the wooden planks, laughing uncontrollably both times. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. As the sun began to dip below the jagged tree line, painting the sky in deep streaks of violet and gold, a lone loon called out across the freezing glass-like water. A haunting, ancient sound that seemed to vibrate right through the wooden dock. My granddaughter looked up, her eyes wide with innocent wonder. "Grandpa," she whispered, "do the birds know this is their home?" I looked out over the sprawling, untouched wilderness. I looked back at my daughter, smiling quietly from the illuminated porch of the cabin. "Yes," I told her softly. "They know. I spent 37 agonizing years calculating stress loads and building commercial structures designed to withstand the most brutal, unforgiving forces on Earth. When a greedy, entitled man tried to demolish my family for his own selfish gain, he expected a tired old man to simply crumble and fade away. Instead, he shattered against the unbreakable foundation I built. If someone demands the fruits of your lifelong labor, if they have the sheer audacity to call you selfish for fiercely protecting what you bled for, do not retreat, do not compromise. Document everything. Hire a ruthless attorney. Build your fortress. And never, ever surrender your ground. If this story resonated with your core, hit that like button, subscribe, and join the family right here at Dad's Untold Stories.